The Bab al-Mandeb Strait at 3:19 a.m. was 12 nautical miles of contested darkness between Yemen's southern coastline and the Djibouti shore, and the U.S. destroyer was threading it at 16 knots with every tactical system on the ship in an elevated state that the watch team had been sustaining for 4 hours and 11 minutes. The Bab al-Mandeb was categorically different from the Strait of Hormuz. Hormuz was contested by a state actor, the Islamic Republic of Iran, with a command structure, a legal position, a diplomatic channel, and a doctrine that could be studied and anticipated. The Bab al-Mandeb was contested by an armed non-state group operating from the Yemeni coastline, aligned with Iranian strategic interests, supplied through networks that circumvented international sanctions, and operating with the specific tactical characteristics of an adversary that had less to lose than a state actor in any given encounter. The group had demonstrated in the preceding 18 months a willingness to employ anti-ship ballistic systems, aerial unmanned platforms, and high-speed surface craft against commercial shipping and naval vessels. Their operational record was extensive. Their command and control structure was opaque from the outside. Their tactical flexibility was higher than any state navy the destroyer's crew had previously encountered. The destroyer's transit was not voluntary in the discretionary sense. It was required. The U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet was maintaining a continuous presence in the Red Sea to reassure commercial shipping operators and to demonstrate freedom of navigation in waters that the armed group had been attempting to close to what it designated as adversary-linked vessels. The group's designation criteria were inconsistently applied and had included, at various points, vessels with commercial connections to the United States, to U.S. allies, and to nations that the group's patrons opposed. The criteria were not the point. The capability to interfere was the point. And at 3:19 a.m., that capability was demonstrating itself. Bridge CIC. New contacts. Multiple. Bearing 264, range 7.4 nautical miles. Bearing 045, range 8.9 nautical miles. Bearing 292, range 6.8 nautical miles. All contacts are small, fast, speeds between 35 and 42 knots. No AIS on any contact. 3 contacts all closing on our position from different bearings. CPA estimates, bearing 264 contact, 350 yards, time 6 minutes. Bearing 045, 500 yards, time 9 minutes. Bearing 292, 280 yards, time 7 minutes. 3 contacts. 3 different bearings. 35 to 42 knots. No AIS. Night. The specific geometry, 3 contacts from 3 bearings, closing simultaneously, was the same saturation approach geometry that the IRGCN had refined in the Hormuz approaches. But the IRGCN operated under state command and control. The group operating from the Yemeni coast operated with a different decision chain, a different threshold for escalation, and a different calculation about what the consequences of crossing the line from harassment to actual kinetic engagement were. The IRGCN had never fired at a U.S. warship in a direct engagement. The group in Yemen had fired at U.S. naval vessels. The distinction was not theoretical. At 3:19 a.m., the CIC watch officer had already pressed the general quarters alarm. The bridge was at full tactical readiness before the captain arrived. At 3:20 a.m., the captain stepped onto the bridge. He looked at the contact picture for 10 seconds, shorter than any prior encounter assessment in the record, because at 6 to 9 minute CPAs with non-state actors in a strait where the group had demonstrated willingness to engage, 10 seconds was the appropriate assessment window. The picture was clear. 3 contacts, 3 bearings, all fast, all unlit, closing. I have the con. This was not the IRGCN. That distinction mattered for every decision in the next 9 minutes. With the IRGCN, the calculation included the Iranian government's strategic interest in not producing an encounter that crossed into kinetic engagement with the U.S. Navy, a calculation that had been the implicit floor of every IRGCN standoff for decades. The group in Yemen did not have that floor in the same way. It had different incentives, different constraints, and different command authorities. It had demonstrated in recent months that the decision to launch was available at a level of command authority that was closer to the tactical edge than state actor navies typically permitted. The response posture had to account for that difference. He stood at the center console. 10 seconds was the assessment window he had given himself, and 10 seconds was what he had used. In 12 nautical miles of Strait at 16 knots, with 3 contacts at 6 to 9 minutes, 10 seconds was both exact and not quite sufficient. He knew the contacts had not yet resolved in terms of intent. He knew the group's prior encounter record, the commercial vessels they had engaged, the naval vessels they had approached, the specific tactical pattern of multiple simultaneous contacts from multiple bearings that was the group's documented approach protocol for what it called maritime interdiction operations. He knew his own rules of engagement, which were different here than in the Hormuz or the Baltic or the Taiwan Strait, because this was a designated threat area, and the rules of engagement for a designated threat area included conditional engagement authorities that did not exist in the standard gray zone posture. He had 10 seconds, and he had done the arithmetic in them. CIC bridge. Fire control radar active on all 3 contacts, tracking mode. CIWS to active tracking on bearing 292 contact. That's our closest CPA. Get me the Seahawk airborne immediately. The Seahawk launch was not for documentation. At 3:20 a.m. in the Bab al-Mandeb, the Seahawk's role was area awareness and non-kinetic response capability. A helicopter airborne between the destroyer and the approaching contacts had tactical presence that no ship-based system could replicate at night. The fire control radar went active on all 3 contacts simultaneously. The CIWS was in active tracking mode, not passive, on the closest contact. The distinction between passive and active CIWS tracking was operationally significant. In passive mode, the CIWS barrel tracked, but the system was not in an engagement-ready configuration. In active tracking mode, the CIWS was configured for engagement if authorized. No engagement was authorized. The CIWS was in active tracking mode. The Seahawk launched at 3:21 a.m. with its Searchlight armed. CPA to bearing 292 contact, 5 minutes 40 seconds. At 3:22 a.m., the LRAD activated, directed toward all 3 contacts simultaneously in a rotating broadcast pattern. A 3-second directed burst at each contact bearing in sequence, cycling through all 3 every 9 seconds. The broadcast was in Arabic. Unknown vessels approaching the United States warship from multiple bearings. This is a United States Navy warship. You are approaching at high speed from multiple directions. Cease your approach immediately. Any vessel that continues to close within 300 yards of this warship will be subject to defensive response measures. Cease approach immediately. Arabic. Not the Farsi of the IRGCN encounters or the Korean of the West Sea broadcasts. The group operated in Arabic. The broadcast acknowledged that the approaching vessels were being tracked from multiple bearings simultaneously, that the U.S. vessel knew the geometry, and specified a 300-yard boundary with explicit reference to defensive response measures. The broadcast was not a request. It was a warning in the specific category of warnings that preceded authorized defensive action under the standing rules of engagement for hostile non-state actor contacts in a designated threat area. CPA to bearing 292 contact, 5 minutes 15 seconds. At 3:22:30 a.m., the first friction event arrived. The Seahawk pilot's first report: Bridge, Seahawk. I am at 400 feet, Searchlight armed, approaching the bearing 292 contact. I have a visual, small boat, I estimate 10 to 12 meters, at least 2 crew visible, high speed. I am activating Searchlight. The Searchlight activated at 3:22:45 a.m. At 400 feet and 3 nautical miles from the contact, the Searchlight's effective range reached the boat's position and produced the specific daytime and darkness effect of 2.5 million candela at night. The crew on the approaching boat could see nothing except the light, while the Seahawk's camera could see everything the light illuminated. The bearing 292 contact reduced speed from approximately 40 knots to approximately 28 knots, visible on the radar display over the next 2 sweep cycles. 1 contact slowing, 2 contacts continuing. CPA to bearing 292 contact revised, now 4 minutes 30 seconds at reduced speed. At 3:23 a.m., the captain authorized warning flares. In the Bab al-Mandeb at 3:23 a.m., with 2 contacts still closing at 35 to 42 knots and 1 contact slowing but not stopped, the escalation ladder had reached the tier where the warning signal round, the maritime communication that said, "You are directed to stop," in physical, visible, undeniable terms, was the appropriate next step. This was the gray zone's maximum non-kinetic tier. Warning flares were not weapons. They were signals. Their meaning was universal in maritime law. Their appearance over a contact's position at night was unambiguous. Fire signal rounds, bearing 264 and bearing 045 contacts. 2 rounds each. Coordinate with CIC on bearing confirmation before launch. The signal rounds were fired from the bridge wing launcher at 3:23:15 a.m. 4 pyrotechnic rounds, paired toward the 2 contacts that had not slowed. At night, the signal rounds were visible from significant distance, their specific red-orange trajectory arcing over the water, reaching peak height at approximately 150 meters, burning for 12 to 15 seconds as they descended. From the bearing 264 contact's perspective, a searchlight had just come on over another contact to its west, and 2 signal rounds had just arced over the water between them and the destroyer, both simultaneously. CPA to bearing 264 contact, 5 minutes, 20 seconds. At 3:23:40 a.m., the bearing 045 contact reduced speed from 38 knots to approximately 22 knots, visible on the radar display. 2 of 3 contacts had slowed. The bearing 264 contact had not. The Seahawk shifted its searchlight from the now slowing bearing 292 contact to the bearing 264 contact, now at 4.4 nautical miles, still approaching. The searchlight hit the contact at 3:24 a.m. The bearing 264 contact was at 4.2 nautical miles when the searchlight reached it. CPA to bearing 264 contact, 4 minutes, 30 seconds. Speed still 38 knots. At 3:24 a.m., the second LRAD broadcast went directly at the bearing 264 contact, sustained. Vessel bearing 264, you are the only approaching vessel that is not slowed. You are in our searchlight. You are being tracked by fire control radar. You are approaching a United States warship at high speed. Stop immediately. Any continuation of your approach past 300 yards will result in defensive response. Stop now. The broadcast was in Arabic, sustained for 8 seconds at the bearing 264 contact's position. At 3:24:20 a.m., the second friction event arrived. The CIWS, active tracking on the bearing 292 contact, which had slowed to approximately 22 knots under the searchlight, showed an unexpected reading. The contact had slowed but had not turned away. It was now at approximately 2.8 nautical miles, bearing 292, speed 22 knots, still closing. And at 3:24:20 a.m., the EW operator reported, "Bridge CIC. I'm reading a radar emission from bearing 292 contact. It's consistent with a targeting radar, not a navigation radar. The contact is illuminating us. Targeting radar." The contact at bearing 292 had activated a radar system consistent with targeting, the specific emission that would be used by a vessel attempting to generate a weapons engagement solution. The Bab al-Mandeb at 3:24 a.m. was different from every prior encounter in the gray zone record. No prior encounter had included an adversary contact activating a targeting radar against the U.S. vessel. The targeting radar emission was not weapons employment. It was the preparation step before weapons employment. It was the specific action that transformed a harassment approach into a threat posture. CIC bridge. CIWS to active engagement mode on bearing 292. I'm authorizing defensive engagement if that contact closes inside 500 yards with targeting radar active. Active engagement authorization. Not a weapons release, a conditional authorization. If the bearing 292 contact closed inside 500 yards while maintaining its targeting radar emission, the CIWS was authorized to engage. The authorization was in the encounter record from the moment it was spoken. The CIWS barrel was tracking the bearing 292 contact. Active mode. Conditional authorization. CPA to bearing 292 contact, 3 minutes, 30 seconds at 22 knots. At 3:25 a.m., the Seahawk shifted its searchlight from the bearing 264 contact to the bearing 292 contact, the contact with the active targeting radar. At 3:25:15 a.m., the targeting radar emission from bearing 292 ceased. The EW operator, Bridge CIC. Bearing 292 targeting radar has gone inactive. I'm now reading only navigation radar from the contact. Targeting radar ceased. The contact had been in the searchlight for approximately 30 seconds when the targeting radar stopped. The 2.5 million candela on the crew of that contact, visible as a blinding white source from the crew's position on the small boat, had eliminated the visual conditions under which a crew could effectively operate a targeting system while under direct illumination. The contact also began reducing speed further, from 22 knots to 14 knots. CPA to bearing 292 contact revised further, now 3 minutes at 14 knots. CPA projection shifting outward to 350 yards. At 3:25:30 a.m., the bearing 264 contact, which had been in the searchlight until 30 seconds ago, altered course, not dramatically, 10 degrees to the south, away from the destroyer's transit course. Its speed dropped to 20 knots. 3 contacts. All 3 were now slowing. 2 had altered course. The bearing 292 contact had deactivated its targeting radar. At 3:26 a.m., the captain authorized additional signal rounds at the bearing 292 contact, 2 rounds, the same pattern as the prior rounds, to reinforce the message that had been sent to the other 2 contacts. The signal rounds arced over the water at 3:26:15 a.m. The bearing 292 contact reduced speed to 10 knots. The blink came at 3:26:30 a.m. All 3 contacts began opening, not simultaneously and not dramatically. The bearing 292 contact turned south at 10 knots. The bearing 045 contact, which had been at 22 knots, reduced to 12 knots and began a bearing drift west, away from the transit corridor. The bearing 264 contact, which had altered course 10 degrees south at 3:25:30 a.m., continued its southward bearing drift and was now clearly on a withdrawal track toward the Yemeni coastline. The CPA to all 3 contacts was opening. The transit corridor was being vacated. At 3:27 a.m., the CIWS conditional engagement authorization was stood down. CIWS to active tracking mode. Retain tracking on bearing 292 until it is open to 1 nautical mile. The engagement authorization had been in place for 3 minutes and 10 seconds. It had not been executed. The targeting radar had been the decisive condition, and the targeting radar had ceased. The Seahawk maintained its searchlight operation, shifting between the 3 contacts as they withdrew, documenting each in turn. By 3:32 a.m., all 3 contacts were more than 4 nautical miles from the destroyer and continuing to open toward the Yemeni coastline. At 3:34 a.m., the LRAD broadcast a final Arabic transmission. Vessels that have cleared the transit corridor. This is a United States Navy warship. Your vessels and your approach have been fully documented. The documentation has been transmitted to U.S. 5th Fleet Command and to maritime safety authorities in the region. The Bab al-Mandeb Strait is open to lawful transit. We are continuing our transit. The Seahawk recovered to the flight deck at 3:36 a.m. At 3:37 a.m., the destroyer cleared the Bab al-Mandeb and entered the Red Sea. No one on the bridge spoke for a long moment. The helmsman had held course through the transit, through 3 fast contact approaches from 3 bearings in darkness, through the searchlight and signal rounds and the targeting radar activation and the CIWS conditional engagement authorization that had been active for 3 minutes and 10 seconds. Through all of it at 16 knots in the 12 nautical mile strait. There had been a moment at 3:24:20 a.m. when the EW operator reported the targeting radar from bearing 292, when the bridge had a specific quality of stillness that the helmsman had registered without looking away from his instruments. The kind of stillness that was not the absence of action, but the suspension of it, the moment between assessment and decision, in which everyone on the bridge was processing the same information and waiting to see what the next 30 seconds would produce. The next 30 seconds had produced the searchlight on the contact and the targeting radar ceasing. His hands had not moved from the wheel in those 30 seconds. His standing order was the transit course. The course had not changed. The officer of the deck looked at the contact picture. The three contacts were at 6.4, 7.1, and 5.8 nautical miles and continuing to open toward the Yemeni coast. The Bab al-Mandeb was astern. The Red Sea was ahead. He straightened his collar. His hands were slightly unsteady as he did it, not dramatically unsteady, not in a way visible to anyone on the bridge who wasn't looking specifically for it, but the specific fine motor variance that appeared in the hands of experienced officers in the minutes after the conditional engagement authorization was stood down. He had been at the con of a vessel whose close-in weapon system had been authorized to engage a contact for 3 minutes and 10 seconds. The authorization had not been executed. The contact's targeting radar had been deactivated before the 500-yard threshold was reached, but the authorization had existed, and the knowledge of its existence and the specific quality of attention that a bridge crew maintained during an active conditional engagement authorization was something that the body registered differently than passive tracking. He noted the unsteadiness and straightened the collar anyway. The captain walked to the chart table. The encounter report would go to 5th Fleet, to the U.S. Embassy Djibouti, to the Joint Staff's Operational Assessment Unit, and through classified channels to the Interagency Coordination Cell that maintained the institutional assessment of armed non-state maritime operations in the Red Sea. The specific intelligence products from this encounter were the CIWS active tracking data on the targeting radar contact, the signal round deployment record, and the Seahawk's aerial footage documenting all three contacts and their specific equipment configurations at illumination range. Full encounter report to 5th Fleet, complete contact picture from 0319, fire control radar activation log, CIWS status log, including the active engagement authorization period and the triggering condition, all LRAD broadcast transcripts in Arabic, signal round deployment record with targeting, and the Seahawk footage archive. The targeting radar emission from bearing 292 contact should be flagged for the 5th Fleet EW assessment unit. First documented targeting radar activation against a U.S. warship from this group in the Bab al-Mandeb. He paused. Resume standard Red Sea patrol posture. Update 5th Fleet on our position and status. He looked at the chart. Continue the operation. He turned toward the sea cabin. Good watch. The record assembled here speaks in the language the ocean keeps. 3 small surface contacts, speeds 35 to 42 knots, no AIS, no navigation lights, approached a U.S. destroyer transiting the Bab al-Mandeb Strait from 3 separate bearings simultaneously at 3:19 a.m. Contact behavior was consistent with non-state armed group fast boat approach tactics documented in prior Red Sea incidents. U.S. destroyer tactical posture. Fire control radar active on all 3 contacts from 3:20 a.m. CIWS in active tracking mode from 3:20 a.m. Seahawk launched at 3:21 a.m. LRAD broadcasts in Arabic. 3 at 3:22 a.m., 3:24 a.m., and 3:34 a.m. Signal rounds deployed, yes, at 3:23:15 a.m. toward bearing 264 and 045 contacts, and at 3:26:15 a.m. toward bearing 292 contact. Total rounds, 6. Targeting radar activation by bearing 292 contact, yes, at 3:24:20 a.m. Duration, approximately 35 seconds. CIWS conditional engagement authorization, yes, from 3:24 a.m., pending close of 500-yard boundary while targeting radar active. Targeting radar ceased following searchlight illumination. Yes, at 3:25:15 a.m. CIWS engagement authorization stood down. Yes, at 3:27 a.m. CIWS engagement was not executed. All 3 contacts opening by 3:26:30 a.m. Strait cleared 3:37 a.m. Course alterations by U.S. destroyer during transit, 0. Transit speed maintained, 16 knots throughout. Bab al-Mandeb transit completed. Yes, the Bab al-Mandeb does not care about the group's political alignment, its patrons' interests, or the legal framework the group claims. It is 12 nautical miles of water. The transit required the full non-kinetic toolkit: Searchlight, signal rounds, LRAD in Arabic, CIWS active tracking, conditional engagement authorization, and one targeted radar that a Searchlight made it impossible to operate. The Strait was transited. The record exists in both the U.S. encounter log and the targeting radar that was deactivated before it was used.